Today we concern ourselves with the nuclear age, an age born a half century ago and in which we continue to live. It is marked by the advent of a new weapon system, a new technology, harnessing the very energies of the sun, and whose consequences on war, global politics, and human existence itself are momentous. The dawn of that age can be dated quite precisely to July 16, 1945, where in the desert of New Mexico, the first test of an atomic weapon took place, the so-called Trinity Test. Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the so-called Manhattan Project, the vast techno-scientific endeavor that the United States government had committed to discovering the bomb in what it believed was a race against the Germans, Robert Oppenheimer recalled this event, the Trinity Test, in the following way some years later. We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another. Just after the explosion, a fellow scientist is reported to have turned to Oppenheimer and laconically said, "Well, I guess we're all sons of bitches now." And in a sense, Oppenheimer and his more flighty rhetoric and this anonymous scientist were getting at the same idea. Things would not be the same. The world had changed. And with it, science had acquired new powers, new responsibilities, and perhaps new guilt. For the discovery of the atomic weapon has to count as one of the great triumphs of human reason. It rested upon piercing some of the most fundamental secrets of nature, the fundamental conversion of matter into energy. And yet, in doing so, humanity had unleashed such power that it would now make possible the species' extinction by its own hand. A mere 3 weeks later, after the Trinity Test, the new weapon was dropped with devastating effect on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, these events, of course, are commemorated and remembered and often thought of as marking the beginning of the nuclear revolution in war, a moment that transformed the conduct of war. And in a sense, it did. But this development did not, contrary to those bombs, fall from the sky. The advent of nuclear weapons has to be seen in the wider context of a sustained effort in the first half of the 20th century to expand the means of destruction, and along with it, a growing willingness to direct these weapons, this destructive force, at an ever wider definition of the legitimate target. So prior to the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Allies had been conducting extensive aerial bombardment, so-called strategic bombing, at major cities in Germany and Japan in a bid to break the resistance and the industrial infrastructure of those states. In March 1945, a few months before the atomic bombings, the city of Tokyo had been submitted to an intense firebombing, a single night of devastating bombs from the air, which had resulted in 100,000 deaths, as many as either atomic bombing. So it was already the case, prior to the atomic bombs, that cities were being incinerated, and vast numbers of civilians killed almost in an instant. And yet, of course, what was significant with Hiroshima and Nagasaki was that it was achieved with a single device, of course. But underneath that, the wider trend of increasing devastation and destructive force can be seen to have quite a long tail. Indeed, the science fiction writer H.G. Wells remarkably prophesied this escalation in destructive power and the discovery and use of atomic bombs themselves. He did so in a short novel entitled The World Set Free, published in 1914, just prior to the outbreak of the First World War. In the novel, he writes the following: "Certainly, it seems now that nothing could have been more obvious to the people of the early 20th century than the rapidity with which war was becoming impossible. And as certainly they did not see it. They did not see it until the atomic bombs burst in their fumbling hands. Yet the broad facts must have glared upon any intelligent mind. All through the 19th and 20th centuries, the amount of energy that men were able to command was continually increasing. Applied to warfare, that meant that the power to inflict a blow, the power to destroy, was continually increasing. There was no increase whatever in the ability to escape. Every sort of passive defense, armor, fortifications, and so forth was being outmastered by this tremendous increase on the destructive side. Destruction was becoming so facile that any little body of malcontents could use it. It was revolutionizing the problems of police and internal rule. Before the last war began, it was a matter of common knowledge that a man could carry about in a handbag an amount of latent energy sufficient to wreck half a city." So again, Wells here understood well the trend towards increasing power being marshalled in war. He foresaw, remarkably, a culmination in atomic weaponry. He believed, however, that the consequence of this would be to make war impossible. And, well, we'll see to some extent it has. But Wells optimistically believed that this would be the beginning of world peace. Having been found to be useless, states would then relinquish it. And indeed, briefly, post-1945, there was a dream of universal disarmament and global peace as a logical consequence of the advent of nuclear weapons. This, of course, did not last very long, as we shall see. Interestingly, Wells, in the end of the passage I've quoted, also imagined a problem that is a more contemporary one, which is this idea of nuclear weaponry falling in the hands of mere malcontents, that's to say, non-state actors, the disgruntled, the wretched of the earth, who might in turn make use of these weapons in what we would think of as terrorism. And of course, this has now become a much more present concern in the 21st century. As I just indicated, hopes of a perpetual peace following from the discovery of atomic weapons did not last for very long. Already in September 1945, as we can see on this map, the US was already planning for the possibility of targeting Soviet and Chinese cities and positions for atomic bombing. So the Second World War was barely over that the only state in possession of nuclear weapons at this time was already thinking about scenarios in which it would use them against its new rivals. Of course, it soon dawned on the American public that it might also in turn be on the receiving end of this fearsome weapon. This graphic illustration from November 1945 imagines in Life magazine a 36-hour war where atomic bombs, in fact missiles, would land on the American mainland. So For the Americans, the discovery of nuclear weapons and the possession of nuclear weapons might have appeared at first as a form of omnipotence, unparalleled power, but of course it was realized that it would soon mean great vulnerability. And indeed, the American monopoly did not last very long, in fact, much less time than many thought it would, since by 1949, the Soviet Union, through espionage and its own techno-scientific efforts, had developed its own bomb. Thereafter, the systems evolved rapidly. From the first fission devices, the uranium bomb tested in or detonated in Hiroshima, the plutonium bomb detonated in Nagasaki, these eventually gave way to fusion bombs, so-called hydrogen or thermonuclear devices that use fission devices to start the fusion process, a much more powerful nuclear process, which gives far more devastating explosions. Thus, in 1952, the Americans tested the first fusion bomb, Ivy Mike, a 10.4 megaton bomb, nearly 700 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and superior to the combined total explosive ordnance employed in the two world wars. In other words, if you gathered all the explosive force that had been detonated in World War I and World War II, all of these together would not amount to the amount of destructive force detonated in this one nuclear test. Nor was Ivy Mike the most powerful device ever detonated. In 1961, the Soviets exploded sarbomba, a 50 megaton weapon, 5 times more powerful than Ivy Mike. There were even plans for a 100 megaton bomb, but these tests never took place, the weapons being deemed too powerful to be even practical. Launching systems, the means by which bombs would be delivered, also rapidly evolved, gaining in range and accuracy. In 1945, the medium-range bomber, the B-29, was the privileged vector. By 1957, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or so-called ICBM, meant that nuclear missiles could be sent across the world and that full-blown nuclear war could effectively be initiated within an hour of the executive decision. The nuclear revolution posed major challenges, not only to security and to global politics, but to human existence itself. German philosopher Günther Anders postulated that a new age had begun on the 6th of August 1945, one in which we now have the power to transform at any moment, any place, our entire planet even, he says, into a Hiroshima. And so humanity had now acquired a paradoxical omnipotence entailed by the acquisition of the power of self-annihilation. And that the age in which we now found ourselves, this nuclear age, was one that was destined to continue, in that it could only come to a close through the very end itself. For Hans Morgenthau, nuclear destruction negates the meaning of life and death itself by denying the possibility of sacrifice, individual freedom, and immortality through posterity and the continuity of civilization. What Morgenthau is getting at is that if a nuclear war would destroy civilization, would destroy human societies, then in many ways it robs us of much of the possible meaning we could find in life. For whatever we would be fighting for would become meaningless. No one would be there to reap its rewards or even to remember it. And I think arguably these existential truths are so troubling that as a culture we have mostly learned to suppress them. We have learned to live with the bomb in many ways. But we should, and we ought, to maintain our attention fixed on it and understand what the implications of such devices are. And one of the questions, of course, that arises is, what happens to war? Can war still serve a useful purpose when it threatens to be waged with such destructive weapons? Can you still think strategically in terms of means and ends when the weapons you would employ would negate any potential gains or any potential goals you might have? Does nuclear weapons mean the end of Clausewitz? War can no longer be an extension of policy, since it becomes nonsensical.